this is Iran Talk, and in this video I'd like to discuss an interesting topic, and that is whether or not Iranians are actually Aryans. Now, there has been a lot of debate over this topic, and many white nationalists and detractors and enemies of the Iranian nation have stated that Iranians are not Aryans and that the Aryan identity does not belong to Iranians but rather Europeans. However, all of this is just nonsense and there is no truth to this statement, as the reality is that Iranians are indeed Aryans, and Aryan civilization and Iranian civilization are nothing but the same. The Aryan identity first emerged in the Andronovo culture, which was a Proto-Indo-Iranian culture, and from here the identity was transfused into the BMAC culture, which was dominated by native Iranian populations. So these are not the early Iranic populations, which were largely derived from steppe populations, but the inhabitants of the BMAC culture were native populations, which were largely derived from Iranian farmers, and these native farm populations hybridized with the early Aryans, or the inhabitants of the Andronovo culture, to form the Aryans. And these Aryans, or Indo-Iranians as they're better known, are the precursors to Iranian as well as Indo-Aryan civilization, and these individuals were heavily steppe derived, but nonetheless they had native Iranian ancestry, and this native Iranian ancestry was best highlighted by the population samples that have been uncovered from the BMAC horizon. And the BMAC horizon, or BMAC culture as it's better known, was a highly advanced urban settlement, and it was dominated by urban settlements, whereas the pastoralists were mostly nomadic. These pastoralists hybridized with these native Iranian farmers to form the Aryan identity, and this is when the Aryan identity became crystallized. And it was these early Iranians who clustered with Yagnobis which carried this Aryan identity into Iran, and most of them did admix on impact except for the elite. However, by the Sasanian period, the elite was also admixed with the native element, and this native element was, again, in regards to Iran, it was largely made up of the native populations of Iran and not derived from Arab or Semitic sources. In fact, Semitic sources are very, very, very limited in the Iranian gene pool, and the total Semitic admixture in Iran exceeds no more than 3% on average. And I will show calculations, the most recent calculations for Iranian populations at the end of this video, and Semitic derived admixture in Iranian populations is extremely, extremely, extremely limited at around 3 to 4%, and that's essentially it for this part of the video. Now, again, Iranians are Aryans, there's no doubt about this. The Aryan identity did not form, and well, it did exist in the Andronovo culture, but it was not crystallized until the Andronovo steppe pastoralists hybridized with the natives of the BMAC culture. Therefore, Iranians are Aryans, and the reason why Iranians are Aryans is because the Aryan identity did not form until the admixture between the Andronovo steppe pastoralists and the native populations of the BMAC culture, and these hybridized populations then migrated into Iran, and these were the early Iranians, so the Persians, the Medians, and many other groups as well, which arrived in Iran, and these early Iranians then hybridized with the native Iranian populations on impact for the most part. And the elite were the only ones who remained segregated. Nonetheless, they were also largely hybridized, and essentially by the Sasanian period everything became crystallized, and the Aryans of the Sasanian period were largely the same as contemporary Iranians. Now, this is hard to tell without Sasanian era samples, but nonetheless we do have modern tools, and we do have many samples from before the ancient Iranian period as well as after, and all evidence points to 90 to 95% genetic continuity in Iran since the Aryan. I will get into the genetics of the Aryan identity right now, rather Iranians being Aryans. Iranians are Aryans, there's no doubt about it. Iranians are not Semites, they do not have any Semitic related admixture for the most part. Iranians are not East Asians or they're not South Asians. Iranians lack Mongolian admixture or East Asian admixture, which is very limited, and the migration of the Turks really never had a major impact on the Iranian populations. Also, admixture with South Asians is heavily limited, as well as only 1 to 2% native South Asian admixture is detected in Iranians today. So here is the PCA, as you can clearly see, the early Iranians. So this early Iranic sample, which is here best reflected here by the circle and dot, the red circle and the not the dot rather, the X over that. This early Iranian pastoralists is what the early Aryans looked like, and these were the inhabitants which then migrated into Iran and had mixed with the Chalcolithic Iranians who were already living there to form the contemporary Iranians. And this is where the contemporary Iranians cluster. They cluster in between this early Iranian or Aryan sample and these Chalcolithic Iranians. And these Iranians which cluster in between these populations are also Aryans, because the Aryan identity, when Aryan civilization was at its peak in Iran, the native inhabitants of Iran, so this was during the Achaemenid and Sasanian eras, they were already admixed with the native element, and that's why Iranians are Aryans. This is a very important fact here, and you can clearly see that Iranians cluster very far away from Arabs. So these are Saudi Arabs, Bedouins, Hijazi, and Najdi, and I think Egyptians also cluster in that fold, but Iranians do cluster far away from native Semitic populations, and this is quite remarkable as well. But as you can clearly see, Iranians are closer genetically to this early Iranian or Aryan sample than Nordics, than Central Europeans, and even Southern Europeans. You can see the gap between Iranians and this Aryan sample is not really significant. It's very limited, and the Yagnobis, which are an Eastern Iranian group who speak an Eastern Iranian language descended from Sogdian, cluster directly with this early Aryan, and these are an Iranic people. Then even today's Iranians cluster fairly close with this sample set, especially with the early Aryan early Iranian or Aryan pastoralists, and this is also quite remarkable as it shows that the early Iranians they had a major impact on the native Iranian population. Hence, you can see a major shift here between the Chalcolithic Iranians and the modern day Iranians. And now I will get into the calculations to prove this process of assimilation of native Iranian tribes by these Aryans or early Iranians. So for this analysis, I will take a look at 5 Iranian populations, and these calculations are the most updated and they're the most accurate to date, and they should definitely be taken into account when discussing the Aryanness of Iranians. The first population here is the Iranian from Fars, and this sample set has around 17 individuals, and you can clearly see that this early Iranian steppe pastoralist makes up a huge chunk of its ancestry, and these early Iranian ancestry make up around a quarter of its ancestry, and the total percentage stands at around 27%, and this is the main component here, and this shows that it stands at around 27.7%, so around 28%, and this shows that these Fars Iranians are heavily early Iranian or Aryan derived, and it proves that Iranians are Aryans. Now, this is the process of assimilation I was talking about. These early Iranians became admixed with the native population, but the modern day Iranians are very similar to the ancient Iranians of the Achaemenid and Sasanian eras, and this is also evidenced within the phenotypic resemblances between ancient and modern Iranians. But anyways, you can clearly see that these Iranians are from Fars are only around 2% Arab derived, which is represented by the Bedouin, 3% East Asian derived, and 2% South Asian derived, and the total percentage of genetic continuity here is 92 to 95% for the Iranians from Fars, and this is quite remarkable considering the history of the Fars province and the fact that the Arabs and Turks occupied Iran for a very long time. Now next, I am going to move on to the lures. The lures can be seen here now, and the lure stats are also very interesting as they show that the continuity is again there, but the lures have limited early Iranian admixture at only around 16%, and this is because they're mostly native derived. The majority of the lurish popular ancestry is native, but they still have this ancestry, and they only have around 4% East Asian admixture, and their continuity is around 96%, which is quite remarkable as the Lurs are an isolated tribe, and this is very, very amazing and excellent that they have a great deal of genetic continuity. And the Lurs are one of the most isolated populations. So again, they are mostly native derived, but nonetheless, they do have this great deal of genetic continuity since the Iron Age, and this is quite remarkable as well. Now, the next population and the most remarkable is the Zoroastrians, and I am going to take a look at them right now. Next up here we have the Zoroastrians, and the Zoroastrians have around 32% early Iranian or Aryan admixture, and they're also heavily native derived, and they also, much like the Lures, have 96% genetic continuity, and that's also quite remarkable. They only have 3% East Asian admixture and 1% admixture from the South Asian source, and another 1% admixture from an Arab source. Now, this is likely due to one or two individuals skewing it, as Zoroastrians have been proven to have no Arab-related admixture, as they were a highly isolated population, and their high isolation is what has allowed them to preserve their high native Iranian input, and this is quite remarkable. But these are the results for the Zoroastrians, and these are the most accurate results to date, and you should definitely consider them when taking a look at the Aryanness of contemporary Iranians. Now, next up are the Mazandaranis. And the Mazandaranis are quite remarkable again. As you can clearly see that they have 96% genetic continuity, only 2.8% Mongolian related admixture, and 1% Bedouin, 1.2% rather Bedouin related admixture, but the majority of their admixture is native again, and they have around 15% Aryan ancestry from the early Iranian. Most of their ancestry is native, and that's largely due to their isolation away from other Iranians and other Iranic tribes and peoples, and their isolation is largely the result of it's largely the result of their geography. The topography of Tabaristan is very, very and Mazandaran Tabaristan is very, very rugged and harsh. There are a lot of mountains there, and that's why many groups, no matter who came, the Aryans and other groups, were unable to penetrate deep into this region. But they do have 96% genetic continuity, and that's also quite remarkable again. And again, these are the most accurate results to date for these populations. Now, the next population I'm going to take a look at are the cosmopolitan Shi'is, and these Iranian Shi'is are mostly Sayyids and other individuals belonging to the religious elite of Iran, and even they have around 25% ancestry. So before I continue, these individuals are also individuals from in and around Qom, and that's interesting as well. But anyways, they have around 25% admixture from the Aryan populations, and the remainder of their admixture is mostly, they do have a bit more Arab admixture at 7%, but that's again it. Most of these populations are from Qom and southwestern Iran, so that's interesting. Rather, these people, most of the samples are from southwestern Iran and Qom, and this is quite interesting. But nonetheless, they only have around 7% Arab admixture, 3% Mongolian, and 2% South Asian, and they have around 88 or 89% genetic continuity, and that's quite remarkable as well. And they have around a quarter of their ancestry is derived from this early Iranian sample, but these are not representative of the normal average Iranians. These are only the elites, the religious elites, and those individuals who are from southwestern Iran, from the Ahwaz province and surrounds, from Bushehr, from the northern portion of Bushehr, and that's essentially it. These samples are from there, and they paint a very interesting picture. But nonetheless, these Shi'is are not representative of all Iranians. They're a very, very special segment of the Iranian population. Finally, we have the Azeris from Iran, and these Azeri samples are again mostly native, and these are largely derived from Medians, and they have around 17% of their ancestry is derived from the early Iranian or Aryan sample, and most of this largely comes from the Medes, and only around 4% of their admixture can be traced to Arab sources, 2% can be traced to South Asian sources, and 8% can be traced to East Asian sources. And this is obviously expected, as these Azeris, the likelihood of these Azeris having this admixture is not low, as they are a Turkic speaking group, but nonetheless they are also mostly native Iranian, and they have a more than 85% genetic continuity, and the average is around 88%, so that's quite remarkable as well. And that's essentially it for this video. Thanks for watching and take care. And the only reason I made this video was to prove that contemporary Iranians are Aryans, and they're not anything but Aryans. You know, Europeans are not Aryans because the Aryan identity did not exist in Europe. No European nation specifically referred to themselves as Aryans. Only Indo-Aryans and Iranians can be considered Aryans, but even today Indo-Aryans are fairly admixed with the native population, whereas Iranians have largely preserved their gene pool since the Iron Age. Now, the early Iranian admixture was diluted over time, but during the Achaemenid era it did likely stand at this much, and once we get Achaemenid samples we will know the truth, and once we get Sassanid era samples as well, then we will also know the truth. But I think there is 90 to 95% genetic continuity in Iran since the Iron Age. But yeah, that's essentially it for this video. Thanks for watching. Please like, share and subscribe, and I will be more active now. I was going to actually be less active, but now I feel that it's important for me to be more active, as at least until the new channel is launched. Thank you and take care.